Hey Carl, why did the man threaten to sue the restaurant when they threw him out for having a sleeveless shirt on? Because they were violating his right to bear arms. Bare arms? Like he didn't have any sleeves? His arms were bare? No, it was just... I don't know, man. I'm trying to lighten the mood. It's a video on abortion. Hi, and welcome to this video lecture on abortion. In this video, we're going to provide a brief definition of abortion. Then, we're going to consider this issue from the perspective of meta-ethics, descriptive ethics, and normative ethics. We'll also look at a few arguments that are used in defense of abortion and against abortion in the area of applied ethics. Hopefully all of this will give you a better understanding of where you fall on this rather controversial topic. Let's begin with a quick definition of abortion. As the term is used in medical, legal, and moral discussions today, abortion refers to the intentional termination of a pregnancy by removing the prenatal life. This termination can happen at the embryonic or the fetal stage of prenatal development. It can also happen in the germinal stage, that is the first 2 weeks after conception, but most women don't even realize that they're pregnant at this point. In the embryonic stage, weeks 3 through 8 of the pregnancy, abortions are either medical abortions, that is induced by medications, or surgical abortions, that is completed through a surgical operation. During the fetal stage of the pregnancy, that is anything beyond 9 weeks, most abortions will be surgical, although a medical abortion may be possible in the 9th week of pregnancy. Now, if it doesn't go without saying, I'm not giving any medical or legal advice in this video, nor am I at this point taking any moral stance or stating what is or should be legal. I'm simply relaying some common information regarding what an abortion is, so we're on the same page for the remainder of this video. Having established a working definition of abortion, let's talk about why it's such a controversial topic. Abortion is one of those topics that really stirs up people's passions. And it's not hard to see why. On the one hand, a large group of people believe that abortion entails an act of murder, the unjustified killing of an innocent human being. On the other hand, a large group of people believe that the right to an abortion is an essential aspect of women's bodily autonomy, the right to make choices about what happens with their own bodies. If the first group is correct, the Guttmacher Institute's estimate that there were over 900,000 abortions in the United States in the year 2020 carries the weight of a moral atrocity. If the second group is correct, recent state laws developed in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade is nothing short of a profound violation of civil rights, particularly the civil rights of women. With people identifying the stakes so high, it's not altogether surprising that they're so invested in the issue. Adding to these stakes that abortion has become perhaps the quintessential culture war in the United States, it's difficult to overemphasize how divisive the issue is. Now, the danger with these types of issues is that it often becomes difficult to see our own personal bias because we're so passionate about them. And it's tempting to demonize people who disagree with our views. This is one reason why I think it's important to emphasize, at the beginning of this video, the significance of disconfirmation. I think one of the best measures of a person's grasp on a controversial issue like abortion is not the effort they put into confirming their personal view, but rather the effort they put into disconfirming it. As I've noted in a different video, human brains seem wired to protect beliefs that are important to us. Whether consciously or subconsciously, when our views are challenged, we'll engage in either rationalization, which means we explain away evidence that doesn't fit our views, or confirmation bias, which means we ignore arguments and evidence that don't fit our belief and simply seek out arguments and evidence that do. Psst. As a quick side note, if you feel strongly about abortion, you're probably thinking right now that the other side does this, but not your side and definitely not you. Just as a heads up, that probably means you're a prime candidate for rationalization and confirmation bias. To make this point rather informally, I ran an unscientific experiment in a classroom on a few occasions. I told the students we were going to discuss the topic of abortion. On the day of the discussion, I asked all of the students to write down their unique view on abortion on a piece of paper. Then, I put all of those pieces of paper in a bag and passed it around. Each student had to pull out one piece of paper at random. For the whole debate, they had to defend whatever position they pulled out of the bag. It was completely random. In many cases, students were defending views that were rather different from their own personal views. As you might guess, the debates did not go very smoothly. The students really struggled to defend positions other than the ones that they held. Now, given what I've said about human brains and confirmation bias, this result isn't entirely unpredictable. But it does raise an important question. If we can't articulate the best reasons that people hold beliefs that are different than ours, and especially views that contradict ours, then how can we justifiably have confidence confidence that our own view is correct. In other words, if all we've ever tried to do is confirm our own view, but we've never really worked to disconfirm it by seriously considering the best counter-evidence and counter-arguments, we probably haven't earned the right to entertain any confidence that our view is correct. Let's move on from those preliminary matters and look at some meta-ethical considerations with regard to abortion. First, there's the issue regarding whether abortion is objectively moral or objectively immoral. I'm not going to address this issue specifically in this video, as I address it generally in my video on meta-ethics. So be sure to check that out if you're interested. Second, there's the issue of specific moral definitions germane to the topic of abortion. For example, just about everyone agrees that murder is wrong, but not everyone agrees on whether or not abortion is murder. This raises the question, what is murder? It also raises the question about how to qualify an embryo or fetus. Is the embryo or fetus a human life? And so, what do we mean by a human life? Even more difficult, is the embryo or fetus a human person? And so, what do we mean by the term person? Thinking about terms like murder, human life, and person are important meta-ethical aspects of discussions on abortion. We can also consider abortion from the standpoint of descriptive ethics. The Pew Research Center conducted a poll in March of 2022 in the United States to evaluate the nation's views on abortion. You can find the link to this poll in the description for this video. But a few points are worth noting. First, 61% of Americans believe abortion should be legal in all or most cases. However, 48% of Americans believe that abortion is immoral in cases where it should be legal. This highlights that important distinction between law and morality. Second, the argument that human life begins at conception, so a fetus is a person with rights, resonates strongly with people who believe that abortion should be illegal. 93% of Americans who believe that abortion should be illegal in all cases say that argument represents their view very well. 71% of Americans who believe that abortion should be illegal in most cases say the same. For those who believe that abortion should be legal in most or all cases, the argument that women should have autonomy over their own body resonates very well. 86% and 67% respectively. This suggests that, in popular culture, the arguments of the personhood of prenatal life and the bodily autonomy of women resonate most strongly with people. Finally, it's important to note that the majority of the country does not fall into an all-or-nothing camp when it comes to abortion. For instance, with regard to the question of legality, only 10% of Americans believe that abortion should be illegal with little to no exceptions, and only 25% of Americans believe that abortion should be legal with little to no exceptions. The vast majority of Americans, 65%, fall in between these views, leaning toward mostly legal or mostly illegal with varying degrees of exceptions. Let's turn our attention now to normative ethical theories. How might a deontologist approach the issue of abortion? They might begin by asking if the act of abortion violates a duty or obligation we have to the fetus. A deontologist could argue that abortion violates a duty we have toward our fellow human beings, in this case the embryo or fetus, and is therefore never acceptable. And because the end never justifies the means, the deontologist could argue that there are no exceptions to this rule, as Kant argued there were no exceptions for his categorical imperative against lying. We actually see this type of thinking in the magisterial position of the Roman Catholic Church, which describes abortion as an intrinsically evil act, meaning it's forbidden regardless of the context of the act or the outcome it produces. But the deontologist's position would depend on whether or not they consider the fetus to be morally equivalent to a human person. Interestingly, Immanuel Kant, the father of deontology, argued that a person must have rationality and autonomy. And there's a lot of debate about whether or not Kant would have acknowledged prenatal life as persons. A utilitarian, who believes that we should always act in ways that produce the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of morally relevant beings, would argue that acts of abortion must be evaluated by the outcomes they produce. Whether or not the fetus counts in the utilitarian's moral calculations depends on whether or not the utilitarian considers them a morally relevant being. If the fetus isn't morally relevant, it seems that abortion would be morally acceptable in almost all cases. And we see this thinking in utilitarian thinkers such as Peter Singer. But even if the fetus is morally relevant, abortion could still be justified for the utilitarian if the overall good outweighs the overall bad. This could either be measured on a case-by-case basis, or it could be measured on a policy basis. That is, whether abortion policies produce more overall good or more overall harm. Someone approaching abortion from a principlist perspective would have to weigh the various prima facie obligations at work. This would also require some sense of how the fetus is morally relevant. For instance, does the principle of non-maleficence, or non-harm, apply to a fetus before the fetus has consciousness or sentience, that is, the ability ability to experience pleasure and pain? When does the principle of beneficence apply to a fetus? And how do we weigh it against seeking the well-being of the woman? How does a commitment to non-maleficence toward the woman and the autonomy of the woman weigh against the well-being of the fetus? How do issues of justice work in all of this? The principlist would have to weigh these principles in different situations to decide how to resolve the moral quandaries raised by abortion. Having considered these various approaches, let's take a look at a few arguments in favor of and against abortion. As noted in the descriptive discussion on abortion, the two arguments that resonate most strongly with people, at least in the United States, in the abortion debate are, on the one hand, that the embryo or fetus is a human life deserving of the moral status and rights of personhood, and on the other hand, that women should have the autonomy to make decisions regarding what happens to their own bodies. To be clear, there are many other arguments, and they often overlap to create multi-tier leveled arguments either in favor of or against abortion. But here we're just going to focus on these two. One might argue that abortion is immoral and should be illegal in all or most cases because the fetus warrants the same protections as other human persons. This argument can be made in a number of ways. First, we might say that the fetus actually is a human person, and that's why it deserves the rights of personhood. This argument has in its favor the scientific fact that, at the moment of conception, a zygote is a genetically complete human entity, an individual member of the human species in terms of genetic code. This does raise a separate question about what it means to be a human entity or a human life. For instance, if we believe that there is an immaterial aspect to humans, such as a soul, we could then ask, does a zygote have this? And if not, when is the so-called moment of ensoulment? If the entity isn't a human life at this point, in some way other than genetically, it's unclear when it becomes a human life and why it becomes a human life at that later point, though some might argue for a particular level of brain development and activity. The personhood argument has some issues. One, it would require establishing when personhood actually occurs. Many would say it occurs at the moment of conception, but this raises the question, what about this single-cell genetically human life makes it a person? If the term person simply means human life, then it's unclear why it's morally relevant in and of itself. In other words, why does simply being a member of the human species make you worthy of the status and rights of personhood? Peter Singer refers to this issue as speciesism, because we're just arbitrarily drawing moral lines. If you respond by saying, humans are persons because we're conscious, rational, and have speech, then you must admit that these capabilities don't apply to all humans, and they certainly don't apply to zygotes, embryos, and fetuses. So then, while a fetus, and perhaps even a zygote, can easily be considered a human life, it's unclear whether they can be considered a person. Second, we might argue that fetuses contain in themselves the full potentiality of personhood, and that this potentiality merits the status and rights of personhood. This argument has the benefit of capitalizing on the scientific claim that, left to their own devices in typical circumstances, fetuses will develop into what we all recognize as human persons with legal rights. And this argument bypasses the question of when that happens. But again, the argument is not without issues. Does the potential to become a rights-bearing agent mean you should have those rights before you actually become that agent? The Australian philosopher Stanley Benn says no, noting that having the potential to become the President of the United States doesn't give you command over the armed forces. In other words, you don't get the rights and benefits of being the president until you actually become the president. Second, the question of what constitutes personhood remains. Depending on how we define personhood, certain fetuses might not be protected because, if they have severe disabilities, fetuses may or may not be potential persons. A third argument that is related to both personhood and potentiality comes from the philosopher Don Marquis. Marquis argues that, generally speaking, murder is wrong because it ends a future like ours. In this sense, to the extent that others are like us, taking their life can constitute an act of murder, or at least something morally akin to murder. Because fetuses, or at least developmentally typical fetuses, will become like us, and therefore have a future like ours, killing them is an immoral act akin to murder. Marquis's argument avoids the weaknesses of the previous two arguments. First, he doesn't have to say when a fetus becomes a person. Second, he doesn't have to argue that the fetus has the rights of a person because it will potentially become a person someday. He only has to demonstrate that murder is wrong because it robs an entity of a future like ours. If this is true, then abortion does seem to be a seriously immoral act because it robs an entity of a future like ours. But Marquis's argument has two weaknesses. First, as he acknowledges, his argument only protects humans, prenatal or otherwise, that are sufficiently like us such that they have a future like ours. This raises the question, does Marquis's definition of murder apply to fetuses and adults who have severe disabilities? Marquis actually acknowledges it might not, because they're not sufficiently like us in terms of capabilities to have a future like ours. Second, Marquis argues that murder is wrong because it ends a future like ours. But anytime someone kills a human being, it ends a future like ours. However, we don't think of all killing as murder. So, while abortion does end a future like ours, it remains to be demonstrated whether it's akin to an act of murder or an act of killing that doesn't qualify as murder. That is, an act of justified killing. After all, abortion is almost a completely unique ethical situation, inasmuch as it involves two human entities who are biologically connected to one another, with one being dependent on that specific other's body for survival. It may be that this unique aspect of abortion makes it more akin to killing, which also ends a future like ours, than to murder. On the other side of the spectrum, one might believe that abortion is moral and should be legal in all or most cases, because they believe the autonomy of the woman outweighs the moral status of the fetus. Again, this argument can be made in a number of ways. First, one can argue that the fetus has less moral weight than the woman, so the woman's decision about what to do with her own body is typically definitive. This argument has the benefit of embracing the autonomy of obvious human persons, women, regarding what they do with their own bodies. In doing so, it provides women with a lot of empowerment in terms of their physical, emotional, and psychological well-being, as well as their personal and professional aspirations. In terms of issues, this argument rejects the full personhood of fetuses, but it's unclear when and why full personhood should be ascribed. Is there a morally relevant difference between a 15-week-old fetus and a newborn infant? And if so, what is it? Also, while bodily autonomy is an essential right, the question remains as to whether or not it should be a right without limits. For example, while I have bodily autonomy, I don't have the constitutional right, and many people would think it would be immoral, for me to seek medication that will end my life if I'm not terminally ill. Second, one can accept that a fetus has equal moral weight to a woman, but still argue that a woman's decision about what to do with her own body is typically definitive. The philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson famously made this argument with a controversial thought experiment. She imagined someone going to sleep, only to wake up finding themselves biologically connected to a famous violinist. They are told that the violinist is terminally ill, and the only way the violinist will survive is if they remain attached to the violinist for a prolonged period of time. Thomson argues that, while it would be kind to stay connected to the violinist, the person has no moral obligation to do so. That person gets to decide what happens with their own body, including choosing to detach from the violinist and allowing them to die. A number of philosophers have noted that Thomson's example doesn't seem to resemble most pregnancies, since the person is initially connected to the violinist through no action of their own. The only parallel would be a case of rape. Thomson has offered other thought experiments in response, but all of them aim at one point. Bodily autonomy outweighs the right to life when that life is uniquely dependent upon one particular body. Since this is always the case in pregnancy, at least up to the point of viability, the woman's autonomy always outweighs the right to life of the fetus. Thomson's argument is interesting because it bypasses the issue of when personhood is achieved. But it's unclear whether Thomson's examples justify abortion in cases other than rape. Furthermore, Thomson acknowledges that her argument only justifies detaching from the fetus, not killing the fetus. But this raises the question of whether abortion procedures simply detach the embryo or fetus, or actually kill the embryo or fetus in the process. In this video, we've provided a brief definition of abortion. We've noted reasons why the issue is as controversial as it is. We've explored some meta-ethical considerations about abortion. We've looked at abortion from the perspective of descriptive ethics, at least in the United States. We've considered abortion from the perspective of some normative ethical theories. Finally, we considered two common categories of arguments used in favor of and against abortion. Until next time, farewell.